Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get people talking. As regular listeners will know, I love a list and I love an excuse for a special episode. Happily, the New York Times provided both in the form of their best books of the 21st century so far list. I love this list because everything about it felt to me like an invite to a conversation. And so, I'm joined by three of my very favourite people to talk books with: returning guest, friend and fellow book quiz teammate Sarah Oliver, who readers might remember from our Women's Prize show last year. She's with me in person here in London. Phil Chafee, who mans the Book Club Review's US Bureau, is dialing in from New York. And of course, the one, the only, the OG Laura Potter is joining us from Vancouver. We can't wait to get started, but before we do, have a quick listen to this message about our sponsors, Serious Readers, and why we can't get enough of their reading lights. Hey listeners, before we get started, let me just tell you about our sponsors for this episode, Serious Readers, who make these lights that Laura and I love.
We are big fans. What makes the lights special? Well, they feature daylight wavelength technology, which replicates the daylight spectrum.
What that means is that your eyes get the light that they need, with the result that words stand out more clearly on the page, your eyes get less tired, and Laura and I found we were able to focus more easily. All of which is good news if you're serious about reading.
An added bonus is you can read in bed without the light annoying your partner, because the beam is so contained.
So if you're interested to try them out, we have a special offer for you. If you visit seriousreaders.com/BCR using the code BCR, you get £100 off any HD light. And if you're in the UK, you'll also get free delivery. Outside of the UK, you can still take advantage of the offer, but there will be a shipping charge.
And what I'd say is give them a try. You have 30 days to decide if it's right for you, and if you're anything like us, you won't want to send them back.
I am so excited to have you all here with me to discuss the list. I mean, I feel like for all of the people listening to this show, I don't even need to explain what list. They know what list. It's the list. So summer 2024 was the summer when the New York Times brought out their list of the best books of the 21st century. And it's kind of all we've been talking about and thinking about ever since, in the best way, I think. Yeah. You know, summer's always pretty rich for reading recommendations. You get all those lovely summer reading lists in all the newspapers, and it's just generally quite a rich time for books. And then this list, it just feels like the gift that's just kept on giving and giving, because it's spawned 1,000 conversations and articles and other podcasts and all these different things. So it's just been, I think, for me, the most wonderfully generative thing. But maybe that's getting a little bit away from what we actually thought of the list. I should quickly run people through how they set the terms by which they came up with this list. They decided to ask 503 authors and folk from the literary world in the US to submit top 10s, their top 10 best books published since 2000. And what they crucially didn't do was ask those authors to define best. So it was left open how they wanted to say what was best. They then took those top 10s and then, through some mathematical magic that I didn't quite understand, they then showed them choices of books, and they were to pick one from each two. And somehow that translated into this ranked list of 100 books that we ended up with. So it is in order, and it starts at 100, and then number one is the best. Quickly, I thought I should just read the top 10. Anyone who hasn't read the list, I will post a gift link. The New York Times, one of the very many wonderful things about it, is that if you're a subscriber, they allow you to share gift articles. And so I will post a gift link under this episode. And if you haven't read it, you will be able to get past the paywall and read it. I should also say, if you think you could afford to, that you might consider subscribing and reward them for all this hard work. I love my New York Times subscription. I get so much out of it. The book content's amazing. I subscribe to the food app as well, which is also good. It's all good. But yes, the top 10. Number 10, Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. 2004. Number 9, Never Let Me Go, Kazuo Ishiguro, 2005. Number 8, Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald, translated by Anthea Bell, published in 2001. Number 7, The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, 2016. Number 6, 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, translated by Natasha Wimmer, 2008. Number 5, Jonathan Franzen, The Corrections, published in 2001. Number 4, The Known World by Edward P. Jones, published in 2003. Number 3, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, published in 2009. Number 2, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, 2010. And number 1, little drum roll, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, translated by Anne Goldstein, 2012. So that is the top 10 of their list of 100. So maybe instant, quick reactions, hot takes. Sarah, you're closest to me physically. How did you feel when you first encountered the list?
Well, I'm excited about it. I love that it's interactive. You can actually go through and tick which ones you've read and which ones you want to read. And at the end, you get a list that you can compare it with your spouse or whomever. And that's nice. I am surprised by the order. I mean, number 1, I was like, it's good, but I don't think it's the best book. Whereas when they've done other lists, I think they did, maybe at the year 1999 or 2000, they did the best books of the century. And I remember Beloved was number 1. And I thought, yeah, that makes sense. So some of this was surprising, the order. And then other people were people I keep hearing about, Roberto Bolaño, for example, who have only read short stories of. And that might push me over the edge to read. You didn't mention pages, but that's quite a few pages.
It's a chunkster.
Yeah. But maybe this is enough to make me read it.
How about you, Phil?
Yeah, I'm always a sucker for lists. I thought this was really fun. Another functionality you did not discuss is, I don't know if you can go to all, there's not a list of like all 503 ballots, but you can click over to the list of authors and then click authors or critics and click on the name and get the ballot. So that is actually almost better in my mind than the list itself, because for authors you really like, you can get these amazing suggestions, some of which didn't make it into the big list if it's a much lower profile book. And then for the actual list itself with the rankings, obviously we'd all do the rankings slightly differently. I have no problem with saying Elena Ferrante is the best living writer. I think she's astonishing, and I have no problem with any of her books being number 1. But there are books such as the 3 I had not read on the top 10 list. Kazuo Ishiguro, I had never actually read Never Let Me Go, or The Warmth of Other Suns, or The Known World. And all of them, I know I have to read this. So in the past week, I just read Never Let Me Go, and it is really great. So it was really good just to be reminded of the books you know are out there. And you have to just, I should finally get around to reading that. So yeah, I just think it's fantastic and very, very fun. Also, there was, I don't think you mentioned Kate, separately, they asked readers of the list and of the New York Times to submit their own ballots of their own top 10 from the past 25 years. 24 years, actually. It's a bit weird. They didn't wait a year to do this. And there's a separate readers list where they did all the readers' ballots, presumably many more. And that skews much more towards bestsellers and to genre stuff. But weirdly has some precise overlaps, including Never Let Me Go, which is number 9 in both lists.
I thought the way they rolled this out was so fantastic. From the very beginning, where they started releasing the author lists, and there were all these funny things, like the fact that Stephen King had nominated one of his own books. I
Loved it. Loved it.
I mean, even that got everyone talking from the get-go. And then, so this drip, drip, drip of all these lovely author lists. And then finally you get the big list. And it was done in such a joyful, interactive way. So yeah, it was designed for sharing and discussing and debating, wasn't it? And then finally the readers' lists, and more of an excuse to have conversations. So yeah. Laura, how about you?
It makes me cross.
It makes you cross.
This whole system seems incredibly stupid. There's no criteria for what best means. It's obviously the best books since 2000 that we can remember having read that had enough cut through in the English-speaking world, right? These are not the best books. These are the best books that bubbled up in the market in the English-speaking world. So there are novels and books in translation, but they're not representative. I love a summer reading list, but as soon as you start ranking and the system of ranking, I mean, Kate, the way you put this caveat in that we should take it with a grain of salt, but I'm just like, how, you know? And I mean, there's a lot I do disagree with, but it's totally arbitrary. Like, sure, Alana Ferrante could be number one, but so could Hilary Mantel. So could be a different writer.
Yeah, if I could ask Gilbert Cruz, who's the books editor at the New York Times, one thing, I would like him to explain to me how they got from, what must it have been, like 5,000 author-recommended books to this 100 via this strange, well, they look at 2 and they choose 1, and like, well, how does that work? But then I did have a chat with a friend the other day who is quite good at maths, and to her it all seemed very clear. So I was like, oh, I just felt reassured. I was like, someone understands this. I don't, but someone does.
I mean, theoretically, you could throw it all into an Excel spreadsheet. I agree with Laura on the language thing in particular, where, they're very unclear. They have a Tove Ditlevsen in here, who was a Danish author and who wrote her Copenhagen trilogy in the 1960s. And there was a recent translation, but how on earth did that qualify? Also, they did have some of the ballads were from non-US authors or sources. So it made it this pretense of therefore being a global thing. But I would love to have really broadened it out and had it be a bit less American-centric.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that was for me, some of the stuff that was missing, I guess, isn't American. Or actually, I found some things are very American and aren't on the list. And I was surprised by that. But I guess if you're ranking the way that it's done, it's also about broad reach, right? It's something that 500 or 400 or 300 people would agree on as, not disliking or whatever. And that would keep bumping things up.
It's not like a regular jury where they've all had to read the same books, right? And then debate and rank them. It's just whatever you've read, and we can't read everything.
They said, after casting their ballots, respondents were given the option to answer a series of prompts where they chose their preferred book between 2 randomly selected titles. We then combined data from these prompts with the vote tallies to create the list of top 100 books. And I was like, I don't understand that. But hey, never mind. I don't mind. I don't care because I just love this so. Unlike Laura, to me, this has been just such a wondrous, joyful thing. It's brought enormous pleasure to my life, mainly because it's been so much fun thinking about all of these books, being reminded about so many of these books, and having my own little, hang on a minute, they haven't put this person on, or some of them I was like, yes, that is such a great book. I'm so happy that that's on the list.
I'm dying to see how many you've read.
Oh yeah, what is everyone's number?
Numbers is an interesting. Yeah, would you do a number? Phil, would you be prepared? Laura, would you be prepared to put your?
I'm scared of you guys saying it to you. I'll say it to layman.
But it's a bit like the end of the year. Oh, I've read X books, and I think it can get a bit.
Kate speaking on behalf of herself.
Yeah.
Kate's like, well, I don't know, guys.
Right. That's
I read more than you.
How I feel about it.
I reckon Phil's read the most.
Exactly. I know any number I can come up with will easily be outshined.
I don't know.
So I don't think
I'm under half.
Should we guess? Okay, right. Hang on. Let's see. Okay. I think Phil's read a lot.
We said so it's 47.
I think Phil's read over half.
No, I just said under half. And to be fair, Sarah got it.
I was listening.
It is 47. So.
How did you know?
Because he said under half.
So at the time of the list, I had read 54, and I've now read 55. Because since the list came out, I read the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. Oh my God, how could I have missed that book? It is so unbelievably brilliant. And did we talk about it on the pod, Laura? Did you tell me about it?
I'm not sure. I mean, I loved it. It's a great series.
I feel like maybe you did, and I was a bit dismissive of it. It's amazing. It's completely amazing. It's this fantastic, incredibly immersive fantasy set in what's recognizably our world, but far in the future. And there's been some huge environmental cataclysm, and this thing is ongoing. And it's been millennia, and humanity has learned to eke out survival between these seasons where the planet becomes uninhabitable. It's all to do with geological things going on. And there are these certain people who have the ability to affect the earthquakes to kind of like harness that power and control it. And in the context of this novel, these people are seen as very dangerous because they equally have the power to trigger things. And so the principal character is someone who has this ability and is sort of in a situation where she's trying to figure out what her place is in this world. And it's all very complicated and difficult. And it's not even just one character. There's a whole set of characters loosely linked together. And I have been so dazzled by it, so immersed. I read book 1. I immediately powered on to book 2. I was so happy to be reading these books. And I, again, was like, yes, thank you, New York Times. I'm so happy now that I've discovered the 5th season and how great it is. So that was a good one for me. But yeah, let's come on then to the books that we think maybe they overlooked or we would have liked to have seen on there. We're each going to do 5, and that will give us, give or take, some potential overlaps. A book club review, top 20.
Do you want to go one by one or do everyone list all 5 in a row?
Ooh, good question.
No, I think maybe all 5 in a row, but with commentary from the Peanut Gallery.
Yeah.
How could you?
Okay.
Definitely. Yes.
Laura, tell us your top 5.
Oh, all right. In some ways, it started off easy. And then I guess really for the fifth one, I was on the fence.
Before we start, Laura, how are you defining best? Set out your terms.
The best books that I have read since 2000 that I remember reading, with a strong bias towards recent books I've read because I don't remember what I was reading like 24 years ago.
Okay, very fair.
So I am following the New York Times list with Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. I am a huge Hilary Mantel fan and I love Wolf Hall and I love that series. It can do no wrong in my mind, partially because I love historical fiction. So, it brings everything that I like into one wonderful book. Next up, a bit different, is The Years by Annie Ernaux. Her memoir, but also a memoir of a French generation, her parents, and then her own coming of age in the 20th century. I had to Google that to be like, was this published since 2000? I really hope so, because it's the best book I've read in recent years. We did it for book club. And the first chapter made me think about time and memory differently than I ever had before. And differently than I think any philosophical tract could have made me think about that. And next up is Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders. I listened to that book and I feel like it's etched into my memory at this point. It's interesting because I don't really listen to that many books anymore.
That is one of the best books to listen to, though, because it has this massive cast, so it really is its own experience. And it's one of the books Audible's put the most effort into.
Yeah, it's almost like listening to a play, but in a different form than you would ever encounter on stage.
George himself is one of the characters, isn't he?
I mean, there's many. Is he a bit part?
Maybe.
Yeah, I think he's in it.
There's
There's like 100
I could find a
Yeah.
role for him.
Sure.
And then another book I listened to, and maybe my recall of these books is stronger than reading on the page. I don't know. I wouldn't have thought so. But fourth on my list is East West Street by Philippe Sands.
Oh, yes. Oh, my God, yes.
I don't know if it sounds depressing or dry, but
Yeah,
the
that should have been on the
origins
list.
of the conceptual idea and language around crimes against humanity versus genocide, and the stories of the lawyers and their family, and his family, Philippe Sands' family, in pre-war, is it Ukraine? Lvov? And then the aftermath.
Yeah.
So those were easy. Those are my first 4. Can I have also rounds or do I need to pick one of the 3? No, I'm doing 5. Do I have to pick one for my 5th?
Yes, you do. Although you can mention the also rans.
Then I'll pick The Trees by Percival Everett, which I think is a classic. I haven't read his latest books. I know that Bill, having read James, his latest novel, said it's an instant classic in his mind. Perhaps that
So
would,
good.
have
It's
pipped
amazing.
The Trees to the post. But The Trees is almost, it's like a horror, comedy, race war, crime thriller. It's an incredible read and totally surprising. Oh, Sarah's on her phone.
I'm going to write that down.
You can listen to it back. That's the brilliant thing about these conversations.
My also rans were Free by Leah Ippy, which I thought was
That's a good
just,
one.
again, somewhat mind-blowing and making me think about history. And this is the transition of Albania from, was it communism? I always look to Phil for my fact-checking. Until I'd read this book, I assumed it was communism, but socialism of their variety into free trade capitalism and the destruction that inflicted on families and culture. That is a fantastic memoir that also made me think about capitalism differently. And then Deborah Levy's series. Perhaps not because they're the best books since 2000, but they're very important books to me. Her memoirs, The Cost of Living, Real Estate. I can't remember the first one. I read them out of order, and I think anyone else could too.
What is that third Levy book?
Yeah.
We've talked about them so many times on the pod, haven't we? We are big fans. That's a good list. Yeah, nice to be reminded of Philippe Sands. And that makes me think actually of Edmund Duval's book, The Hair with Amber Eyes, which again, I just sort of forgotten about. I don't think I would put it in my top 5, but it's a really good read and it felt like a really significant book. It's almost like that's the thing. I didn't really know the expression recency bias until very recently when I kept seeing it. And I understand it's true. You know, the new ones are always freshest in your mind and it's hard to go back. And all my books are in boxes, so I wasn't able to go through my shelves and be reminded in that way. Who should we have next? Phil, do you want to follow that?
Sure. Let's start with provisos. First of all, I fundamentally agree with Laura that ranking things is a preposterous exercise. And I feel like most of the top ones that I've read of the actual New York Times list, I'd be very happy with as my top 5. I think a lot of Laura's I'd be very happy with. Those are all amazing books. And as I said, I think Elena Ferrante is an astonishing writer. I think Ishiguro, for me, basically only writes perfect novels. I would happily put Never Let Me Go or Clara and the Sun those are the big ones this century. But I did not put any of those on. My top 5, therefore, are more selected because they are not as much on the lists. I would start with The Master of the Senate, which is the Robert Caro book. It's a third in his biography of LBJ. So there's 4 books so far, and we are waiting, hopefully, for him to get the 5th and get to the end of LBJ's life.
And book 4 was on the list, wasn't it?
I think
one of them was on the list.
Book 4 was on the New York
Not on the
Times
top
list,
10, but it
nominated...
made the sort of, it was in the top 100.
In the
I forget
100,
where it was higher up. I would choose book 3, which is Before He's President. It sort of opens with him becoming the majority leader in the Senate and goes through basically to when he's picked to be vice president. But it actually starts the first 3 chapters, meaning the first 200 pages or something, are not about LBJ at all. They go into the history of the U.S. Senate, but they also go into the history of Reconstruction and the history of civil rights legislation in the U.S. after the Civil War. And basically what the book is about is, as the most powerful person in the Senate, he then is responsible for passing the first civil rights legislation in 100 years since Reconstruction. So it is both about LBJ, but it is also this incredible, the Caro project here, and also for The Power Broker, his big book about Robert Moses, the civil planner in New York. The Caro project is examining how power works and how people accumulate power and use power. And particularly in this book, it is combining how power works with the moral issue of civil rights and what LBJ, who was himself on a personal level, in many ways deeply racist, a deeply racist Southerner Democrat, comes and does some of the most significant legislation, and how he does it and why. It's just an amazing book. I've only read it once, but it really sits with me. All 4 of the Caro books are astonishing, but this one in particular is very, very good. So that is 1.
Do you have to read all 4, or could you just read one if you're like, I'm just going to dip in?
I actually started with Master of the Senate and then went back to 1 and 2 and then 4 when it came out. And then I am, I will be one of the first reader whenever I can of the new one, if and when it comes out. But no, you don't. Then I would say Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. Maggie O'Farrell is just my favorite writer. I love everything she writes. I know she doesn't stick with you, Laura, but for whatever reason, she vibrates with me. And Hamnet is just so heartbreaking and so gorgeous and such a lush read. Hamnet, to those who don't know, is about Shakespeare's wife, basically. And it covers the period when their son, Hamnet, who then was immortalized as Hamlet, dies of the plague. Kate, you've read that one, right?
I loved Hamnet. And what I love about it as well is that I feel like it unlocks Shakespeare in a way that nothing else I've ever read ever has. You read Hamlet and you will never think about Shakespeare and a Shakespeare play in the same way. And I love it for that. I mean, how extraordinary is that? It is the most phenomenal book, and I'm so glad you nominated it. I was kind of counting on you nominating it, because when it came down to my 5, I was like, so good. Well done, Phil. Excellent.
Done. Then I would say definitely my most obscure cut would be, and hardest for people to actually want to read, is Machete Season, this book by Jean Hasfeld. This is a very hard book to read, but also one of the books that just stuck with me the longest. He was a French journalist who went into Rwanda very soon after the genocide. He actually wrote 2 books, but this book is, he went to a camp where they had all of these Hutu prisoners, and the Hutus were the ones who perpetrated the genocide against the Tutsis. And he found this group of 10 guys from the exact same village, and he interviewed them about what was going through their head. Because what was so unique about the Rwandan genocide is it was people literally slaughtering their in-laws and people on their school PTA, and it was truly crazy stuff. And what is going through their head and how they reconcile it with their religion and with their morals and with God and their relationships. It's just always stuck with me. It's a hard book to read, but sort of like Hannah Arendt, you just are constantly thinking, how close are any of us to this behavior if the right context happens? So yeah, that one, I have not read it in like 20 years. It came out in 2003 or something, but that one really sticks with me. 4 would be In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. That is her, I guess, autofiction. It's memoir story about being in this abusive lesbian relationship, but it also goes through history. It's just incredibly, I'm not doing it justice. It's just all over the place, and it manages to pull strands from everywhere and be very experimental, but also punch you in the gut. I've never quite read anything like it.
Yeah, I agree 100% with all of that. It's an amazing book. It's so inventive, the way she tells the story. One chapter is done in the style of a choose your own adventure. It's absolutely extraordinary. And yet at its core is this very compelling psychological dynamic between these 2 individuals that is absolutely mesmerizing. I think it's an amazing book. Very happy you nominated it. Yeah.
And then my final one is Homeland Elegies by Ayad Akhtar, which I think it won the Pulitzer a couple years ago. He was a playwright, and this is then, again, right on the sort of autofiction, memoir. Details are changed. I think he calls it a novel, but it feels very much like autofiction. A lot of details are not changed, and it's a lot of things. On the most personal level, it's about him and his parents, who were Pakistani immigrants into the US, their lives, then his life as a Pakistani American, particularly after 9/11. But then there's so much more. And sort of like Carmen Maria Machado, he just pulls tons of stuff. Weirdly, like one of my favorite parts was this chapter which goes through the history of the deregulation of antitrust enforcement. It sounds like coming from left field, but it really works. And it just sort of becomes this dissection of modernity, of America, of all of this stuff. It's another one that has not left my head since I read it.
Good reminder.
How did you, Laura, find the chapter about the history of antitrust regulation? I'm curious.
Like, it's not dry.
I'm just slightly skeptical that would something that Phil enjoyed that much be something that I would enjoy?
Yeah. No, it's a really...
Okay, fine.
It's a bit melodramatic even, Phil, isn't it? There's something very rollicking about it.
Did you read that one for book club?
I did, Canadian Book Club.
The one thing I meant to say was the reason I've read as many of the books on the list as I have is without question because I have been in book clubs for 20 years and so many of the books that were the ones that I, merrily could check off were book club books. And I felt so grateful to those book clubs for choosing those books and all those brilliant discussions, but also what amazing taste my book clubs have had over the years. Because it's that little nudge, that little bit of required reading in your life that definitely makes me, I think, read the books that might otherwise feel to me maybe a bit homeworky or a bit worthy or whatever. And then, of course, just so much the richer for it. So God bless book clubs, say I. Sarah, how about you?
Oh, well, I defined my best books as books that I have really harped on, nagged, been so insistent about recommending to other people because I have to discuss them. Because I've had book clubs come and go, and so a lot of times I'm reading something on my own, and if I really enjoy it or if it's really affected me, I really want to talk about it. And so these were the books that I just always found I wanted to talk about that weren't on the list. So I interpreted the assignment as what didn't make the list. The Orphan Master's Son by Adam Johnson.
A book I'd never heard of.
It's a very well researched novel that takes place in North Korea, and the protagonist goes through every strata of life that one could live in North Korea. So he is a radio star for a little while. He grows up in an orphanage. He goes back to prison. He works in a cannery, works in a fishing boat. He works importing fake Nikes into the country. I mean, everything. He goes through everything. And you learn a lot about North Korea. It's just fascinating. It's an example of where fiction can tell you more than nonfiction sometimes. It can be more truthful or more illuminating. And I don't know why it's not on the list.
Yeah, I've never even heard of that one, though. So it feels like it's very under the radar.
It was big in America, but I don't know. Oh, and then I'm going to... the next one was Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead.
Olga Tokarczuk.
Yeah, I just really moved by that novel. She combines so many, it's a mystery, it's a unreliable narrator, but not the kind that you're used to. It's just a kind of a weird, lonely person. It ticks my box that I've realized about myself, which is it takes place mostly outside. So she's obviously a writer who loves nature, who loves being outside. It's clear, and you feel like you're outside in this beautiful location. And she's really profoundly moved and disturbed by something that maybe wouldn't affect me so much, but by the end of the novel, you really feel for that character. And I love the practice of naming. She has her own names for people, which is hilarious. So it takes you a while to figure out who's who, and you'd never know where it's going, which I think is really cool.
I always remember the hard time Sarah had with Piranesi when we did that for the podcast, and you came on the show to talk about it. And it was like the ultimate novel where you're trapped indoors.
You're always inside. But it's wet. Why is it wet? I don't know.
The vestibules.
And then so I kind of cheated for the last bit, and that I picked 3 authors that aren't on the list that really mean a lot to me. And maybe they aren't on the list because they have so many good books. Their votes were split.
Yeah, I definitely think that's...
So in my I could be wrong. I'd love to hear that I'm wrong about this, but I don't think Louise Erdrich was on the list.
That's
she
correct.
was not.
What the fuck? What the hell is that? How? That's insane to me. She's got so many good... I mean, I guess The Night Watchman's what I read or The Sentence. I don't know what I read the most recently. I mean, she's so important to Native American... and There is on the list.
No, it's not.
That's cool. That's a cool book. Yes, it is. I think so.
I think it's not. I don't think Tommy Orange made it.
Because there are so many other lists.
I think There
that's
made
fine. Maybe it was
the
on a
readers
different
list, but I don't think it made the name
Okay.
list.
That makes me feel a little better.
And Louise Erdrich made the readers list too, I think, but not the main list.
Which is crazy. She's amazing. She's a really powerful, beautiful voice. All of her books are multi-generational and include some elements of magical realism and types of justice that we haven't heard about, and time on a reservation and politics. And they cover so many things, and they're so warm, and so they really are transportive.
We did The Sentence when it came up for the Women's Prize. I think it was last year. And that was the first time I had come across Louise Erdrich. And Laura messaged me to say her mum had messaged her to say, how can Kate not know about Louise Erdrich?
But again,
so that's the American thing.
Yeah.
If this were an English list, she wouldn't be on the list. That's fine. But it's not acceptable to not be on the American list, I think. Where's Lauren Groff?
Okay. Let's talk about Lauren Groff.
Let's talk about, is she been blackballed? What's up?
I have to say, when I first read through this list and realized that she wasn't
like, where's Lauren?
I was like,
just scrolling.
The list is void. I'm sorry. What's going on?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. It's weird.
So which book of hers would you put on?
I really love her shorts. She is a master of short stories. I really love Florida. I really love Delicate Edible Birds. But then Faster Wilds we just read, and it's amazing.
It's
it's a very powerful novel. Like when I read James and I read Westerwald, I was like, oh, these kind of like feel similar. These American stories that haven't been told yet that really belong in the canon. Yeah, I think she's on top of her game, and she's an incredible storyteller, but also a great writer and structurer of sentences. And I'm confused. I'm dumbfounded.
So which book of hers would you put on there? You have to choose one.
Oh, shoot. Let's go Delicate Edible Birds, because I like a short story.
Okay.
And I think, I really have a pitch for short stories. Compilations are so good when you finish a novel that you love and you don't know where to go next. Just read a few short stories and then don't even finish the set. Just then dip into the next. It's like a good rebound, but not in a bad way. And then Michel Faber, I think he should be on the list too. I've read a lot of his books, but maybe Under the Skin would be the one that I would pick. It's so weird and so dark and so beautiful and so tight. It's not a long book. It does a lot in that time, but it's like beautiful and uncomfortable, which I really like.
Is that where you would start? I've never read any of them.
Ooh. Okay, so his wife died a few years ago, and he said something like she always made his books, more kinder or light or whatever. No one would describe his books as kind or light. So I was like, oh God, what's next? But yeah, so for my tastes, Under the Skin is also a film adaptation.
Yeah, I've seen the film.
There's a film adaptation. Okay, it's one of my favorite novels and film adaptations. They make some significant changes, but they're both really brilliant. Yeah. So maybe I would do that first, because that's kind of a fun comparison.
Yeah, I've never read him either. And what's bad about that is that I've known you some years now. And I think since pretty much really early when I met you, you were like, you should read Michel Faber. He's so great. I was like, yes, I will. And I've even picked them up in the library before, and they kind of put them, not yet.
For you, I would say The Book of Strange New Things is where I would start.
Okay.
Or The Crimson Petal and the White.
I think that's the one that and I've literally picked it up and then like, oh yeah.
I would do that.
Maybe not right now.
I think the other one might be too dark.
Well, I
you do, yeah, you don't mind.
Yeah, when I actually look at the books that I really love, we'll actually hear my list.
Yeah, let's hear your list.
Is that your 5 then?
That's my 5.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, so my 5. Yeah, there's a little bit of overlap, but I think that's a good thing. I was really thrilled to see The Rest Is Noise by Alex Ross on the list. It was on the list, wasn't it? Or maybe it was on one of the top 10s. That is a book about music. It's a history of 20th century in music, classical music. And it's a real doorstep. It's, Caro-esque in its length, but you would not want it to be one word shorter. It is so fantastic. And it's the book, actually, that I would take with me to a desert island. And the reason for that is because Alex Ross, who's a long-time writer on music for The New Yorker, has the ability to write about classical music and you feel like you can hear it. And I think that's magical. And what's brilliant about this book is that it's a history of music, but actually it's a history of the 20th century through these wonderful, dynamic, charismatic, they're crazy, these classical musicians. They were all completely nuts in different ways because they were geniuses. And so you get all these fantastic, wildly eccentric stories and relationships and all of that. And of course, these great works that they were composing. And crucially, what was going on politically, what was going on culturally at the time. So for me, it was just this really brilliant and engaging way to access history. And I'm not really someone who can sit down and read history. That was never really my thing. But if I'd known about this, clearly this is such a good way in for me. And of course, if you want to, you can listen. There are like playlists coming out of your ears to go with the book. So if you want to, you can actually then go through, listen as you go. I mean, I didn't do that at the time. I listened to The Odd Thing, but that would really bring it to life. I can't imagine. Anyway, it is a book that I absolutely loved when I read it, and I would happily read it again and will do someday.
Can I make a plug, Kate? If anyone from Audible listens to this podcast, make that book, but add the clips in to the Audible experience. It seems like books about music are what Audible should do best, and they do not do that, and it drives me insane. And I've always wanted to read that book, but I'm holding out hope that someday some engineer at Audible will want to spend 2 weeks putting together that book with the actual samples as he's talking about them.
I mean, I love the idea of doing that, but I'm here to tell you, you don't need to. You don't need to, because his writing is so good that you don't need to. And I love that. I thought it was absolutely miraculous when I read it. It's an extraordinary book. So that is that. Can you tell I'm still slightly shuffling my top 5? I mean, I was going to include The Vaster Wilds by Lauren Groff, but I will leave her out because she's in there. I'm just completely and utterly baffled by why more people didn't pick up on The Vaster Wilds and how extraordinary it is. And when I saw The Road on the list, to me, when I read The Vaster Wilds, I felt like that was a feminine take on The Road. And I thought it had the same extraordinary, unsparing, unflinching view of the world. It's very, very dark. It's very, very sad. It's a story of a girl and her struggle for survival, basically. But yet, at the same time, there was something I thought was so extraordinarily consoling about it, and something about the strength of that character that when I'm feeling terrified about things, as I'm sure people can relate to, I think of that character and I feel stronger. And I just think, what a gift that book is. And I'm just baffled by why it didn't cut through more than it did. But that's not my, not my top 5. So I'm going to fly a small flag for some Australian books on my list. I would like to nominate The Shepherd's Hut by Tim Winton, which is a short, devastating read. I actually listened to this one, and I can remember so vividly standing stock still in rooms, doing just nothing, incapable of doing anything, because I was so completely compelled by what I was listening to. His prose is extraordinary. There's never a word out of place, but it's also incredibly vivid. I actually really love this really almost like visceral, punchy quality that I feel like Australian writers, perhaps more than anyone, seem to really embody and do really, really well. And he just feels like the quintessence of that, but also so brilliant on these human relationships. This is a story ultimately about a very strange friendship between two very different people, this young boy and this older man who's gone out to live by himself in the bush, in the wilderness, and the way that these two end up connecting. And I thought it was small and domestic. At the same time, it was just epic and vast, and it blew me away. I thought it was amazing. So nice to have him in there. I would also submit, I think we can have her on there twice, can we?
Yes, it shows
Oh, but then I'd have to, I was going to put Maggie O'Farrell in again for I Am, which is her memoir, which is just amazing. It's so amazing. It's so amazing. I love it so much. But I won't, because then I won't be able to include my contentious last book. So the other one I'm at 3, right? So number 4 is another Australian author. I'm submitting Helen Garner and the book This House of Grief, which is sort of true crime. It's her reporting on a court case of this terrible, devastating thing that happened where a father who was recently divorced, and unhappily so, one day seemingly snapped, and he ended up driving his car over a barrier into a dam. He had his 3 sons in the back. He survived, and they did not.
No.
And it is just this horrifying premise, but it's not a horrifying book to read. It's absolutely extraordinary because, she was in her 60s when she wrote this book, and she just, if you know Helen Garner, if you know her writing, she's absolutely one of those authors where if you've read her, she's incapable of writing a bad sentence. And what she does, like no other author I've read, is that every so often there will be a sentence, and it's almost like every word of it sears into your soul, not in a terrible way, but in a really extraordinary way. You just marvel at her capacity for empathy and insight and these little details that she captures that seem that they're everything. And so, I wanted to have her on the list, and I haven't read much of her. I'm quite late to discovering her myself, but this was one that was written in the 21st century, so in it goes. My final choice, I've hated a lot over this. I feel I will be very mocked for including this. There was, of course, the 5th season, the fantasy inclusion on the list. I would like to submit The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss.
I thought about that.
Did you? Yay.
Yeah.
I just thought, for sheer reading pleasure, I can't think of another book except for possibly Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which I similarly was just had the best time reading this. But I remember I discovered that book because of Laura Potter. We were on this lovely reading holiday we went on together with my book club, a little reading retreat. And we were supposed to be reading I Was Amelia Earhart by Jane Mendelsohn, which is an excellent book. and something else. What's her name? The other Australian author.
Is it Kate?
She's one of these ones. No, people are always going on about her.
Something
very
in
underrated.
something Venus?
Yes, Transit of Venus by
The Transit of Venus.
something like that. Anyway, never mind. Point is, Laura kept stealing off to read something on her Kindle. Like, I noticed her curled up in corners of rooms reading something on her Kindle. And at one point, I was like, what are you reading? And she's like, oh, I'm reading this fancy book, Name of the Wind. You know, embarrassing, don't ask me kind of thing. But, you know, nonetheless, I'm going to carry on reading this. And so that night, I downloaded it. And then for the rest of the trip, I too was completely
It's a forbidden
obsessed.
love. That's what this is. It's your forbidden love number.
It's such a great read. I feel like in a way, maybe the reason perhaps I feel slightly shamefaced about it is because in many ways it feels very conventional. It's a classic Tolkien style world with a hero, and then he goes off to sort of, you get the whole backstory about going to magic school and all these adventures, and there's some sinister force that basically seems to be coalescing around him, and how's he going to defeat it? But yeah, I don't care. I just thought it was impeccably written. The pacing is just supreme. It's absolutely brilliant. It's such a good page turner. He then wrote a second book, which I liked very much. I didn't think was quite as good, mainly because the main character then goes off and he's like abducted by some wood fairy, and they spend ages having sex in copses, and I was a bit like, you know what, whose fantasy is this? I'm not sure it's mine anymore. So
Where's the coffee shop?
He slightly lost me at that point, but book 2 is also good, don't get me wrong. And now everyone waits with similarly bated breath to the amount of people who are waiting for that 5th book by Robert Caro. There are legions of people who are waiting for the 3rd book from Patrick Rothfuss. Sadly, he doesn't show any signs of publishing it. If you look him up online, he's invariably doing other things that are nothing to do with writing. But I don't care, because The Name of the Wind was perfect, and I take it for what it is, and I would include it on my list.
I do agree that's a great read, and I think you're slightly underselling it. It is generic fantasy in the sort of the architecture of the plot, but what's delightful about it, I think, is he just luxuriates in the world. And sort of the plot isn't always that important. There's a lot of stuff about music and theater and all this other stuff that's going on in this world that makes it really fun, even when there's the very generic plot points.
And he, as a writer, you just want to spend time with him. He wrote the introduction to a reissue of The Last Unicorn that I read on holiday a few weeks ago. And I read the introduction and then had to go read The Last Unicorn. I was like, I don't want to read The Last Unicorn. I want to read Patrick Rothfuss. Write the damn book.
He's written a couple of novellas, hasn't he, just to sort of slightly satiate the demand that's out there. And they are also good. They're very good.
They're delightful. Yeah,
and one day,
really good.
Perhaps within the 21st century, we'll get that 3rd book. But
I would also say
I'm not
about
holding my
those
breath.
books, aren't they called like the Kingslayer or something?
The Kingkiller Chronicles.
Kingkiller Chronicles. And he has not gotten to, you have no idea why it's called that. Like, it has not gotten to the point at all. Like, it's all just a setup for something he may never write.
I'm not sure he's got any idea, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, love him, want him on the list.
I was wondering about the Golden Compass when I was thinking
Philip
about
Pullman.
fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that was on some readers' lists, and it's funny
Was
'cause
it
for me
called
that's the least
Station
successful of those
11?
books.
What was it called? The
Hilary St. John Mandel book.
Yeah, that was on the list, I think.
Yeah.
I think
It was.
Was it on the New York Times
Why?
list?
Yeah, it was. It was toward the top. It's a great book.
Well, actually, I haven't read it. I read bits of it.
I like her as a writer, but I don't take her seriously.
Well, maybe they like me with my Rothfuss moment. Maybe they just like, you know what? I'm just going to throw in some fun reads. Although that's post-apocalyptic, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was happy to see Trust in there by Hernan Diaz.
I feel like it's really popular in America. I don't know a lot of people reading it in England, but I know a lot of Americans really like it. So yeah, it's good.
I was happy to see The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde on there.
Yeah, me too.
Which I love.
I
That's
did
so
too.
good.
Stay True by Huao Su,
Yeah.
which
I
don't know if you turned me on to it, Phil, or if I found it. You didn't love
comments
that?
by that book. I was not a fan. No, I was just a bit like, I found it a bit boring, and then I felt bad.
I found it heartbreaking.
I have to I have a grievance about Colson Whitehead, and that I much prefer Zone 1 over the Underground Railroad. I think it's a more exciting, more
That's
unique
his zombie
book.
novel, isn't it?
Yeah. It's really good.
And actually, I havered over including, and if I was allowed a top 10 instead of a top 5, I would have included The Nickel Boys by him,
Oh, yeah.
which is Similarly to The Shepherd's Heart, I'd say, just absolutely extraordinary. It's such an incredible book. Much shorter, much tighter. And
He's a
also
great
it has
writer.
that thing, you were saying about almost like you've identified your thing, books that keep you outdoors. And I realized my thing, the thing I always absolutely love when it's done well, little caveat, is when people take just a sliver of some real truth, some real thing that happens in history, and they spin out and they recover these people. I just had it with a George Orwell book, Wifedom, where Eileen O'Shaughnessy is just sort of brought back miraculously in this text. The Nickel Boys does the same. It really honors the stories of these children who were at this school and what their lives were and what they might have been, and had they lived. And it's all packed in there, and it's such a powerful read, and it's so well done. I loved that book. I thought it was amazing.
One other thing I wanted to say just very broadly is one of my favorite things about this whole rollout of these lists was this iterative thing where others, like I sent it to Kate and Laura, LitHub did a list of all of the best books that were missed.
Yeah, it was a good list. I
Very
thought it was a
literary.
list.
Then there's the readers list. I've had exchanges with friends where we've been exchanging lists, our personal lists, and I feel like I've probably generated more book ideas from just talking about this and people saying what was missed and blah, 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 than from actually what was on the list itself.
Yeah. And that's a fun talking point, right? It is imperfect. That's why there's something to talk about.
It's imperfect and it's preposterous. I mean, lists are silly, but like what it does do is it makes you talk about things, and you also learn what your friends and whatever people love, which is really cool.
My note to end on, I think I would like to raise a toast to all the books we haven't read yet.
Mm.
Kate's
Kate's number is smaller than ours.
I just feel like these fantastic books come along all the time. The N.K. Jemisin was like, how can I not have read this? And I've just read it and loved it, and it's great. I didn't know about it, and now I do, and it's just brilliant. It's so exciting, this idea of all these books that we haven't read yet that we're going to discover. Or I was thinking, maybe the most brilliant book hasn't been translated into English yet, and we'll discover it that way. I personally don't find the number of unread books in the world alarming or overwhelming, particularly since I read Pierre Bayard, who says I don't have to bother reading them to be able to talk about them. That's official. It basically makes me feel happy and excited knowing that these riches await me, knowing I'm going to get to have all these conversations with people telling me their favorite books. And God bless the New York Times and all who sail in her. And thanks you guys for joining me. This conversation's been just a delight.
Thanks for pulling us together.
Thank you. This
so
is really
fun.
nice.
That's nearly it for this episode. Since we recorded our conversation, I've learned, thanks to my fellow book podcasters, who've been more diligent than me in actually asking Gilbert Cruz questions, that the New York Times team approached over 1,000 people, and 503 were the number who responded. I also, just to put paid to any feelings of smugness I might have been feeling, having read over half the books on the list, learned that one of my podcast patrons has read 81. As for books, you'll find all those discussed listed on the episode website page, linked in the show notes. I've also put the link to our friends Serious Readers, where, if you're considering investing in a life-changing reading lamp, you can get £100 off with our offer code BCR. I really love these lights. They genuinely have changed the way I read, so do give them a try. If you enjoy the pod and want to support me in making more of them, and also be part of my bookish club, you can sign up to the podcast Patreon account. The lower tier is just £3 a month, and in return you'll get a weekly email update from me, occasional extra episodes of the show, and at the higher tier, you can come and talk books with me at our monthly book club held over Zoom, with a recording so you can catch up anytime if you can't make the live chat. We're currently reading August Blue by Deborah Levy, with Zadie Smith's novel The Fraud lined up for next month. Come and join us. I would love to see you there. But for now, until the next episode of the pod, thanks for listening and happy book clubbing.